George Michael was trying to hide from the world in a tiny London cafe when an elderly pianist began playing Careless Whisper. What happened next would remind everyone why true music comes from the heart, not the stage. It was a gray, rainy Tuesday afternoon in November 1994. George Michael sat in the corner booth of Rosie's Cafe, a small, forgotten place tucked away in Hampstead Heath that most people walked past without noticing. He was wearing a dark coat, sunglasses, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. After months of intense touring and media pressure, he desperately needed to disappear for a few hours. Rosie's Cafe wasn't the kind of place where celebrities went to be seen. It was the kind of place where people went to be invisible. The walls were covered with faded floral wallpaper, the furniture was mismatched, and the coffee was served in chipped mugs. But it was warm, quiet, and most importantly, nobody seemed to recognize the man sitting alone in the corner. George had been coming to Rosie's for almost a year now, always at the same time, always ordering the same thing: black coffee and whatever cake looked like it needed eating. The owner, an elderly woman named Rose Mackenzie, always smiled at him kindly, but never bothered him with questions or conversation. It was exactly what he needed. Today, however, something was different. In the far corner of the cafe sat an old, upright piano that George had never seen anyone touch. It looked like it hadn't been played in years. The wood was scratched, the keys were yellowed, and sheet music was scattered across the top like fallen leaves. But sitting at that piano was an elderly man George had never seen before. He was probably in his 70s, wearing a worn tweed jacket and thick glasses that had been repaired with tape. His fingers moved slowly across the keys, playing gentle melodies that filled the small space with warmth. The man's name was Harold Chen, though no one in the cafe knew his story. Harold had been a professional pianist for 40 years before arthritis forced him to retire. His wife Martha had passed away 3 months ago, and he'd been wandering London's streets every day since, looking for a place where he could play piano and feel connected to something beautiful again. Rosie had taken pity on him 2 weeks ago and told him he could play the old piano anytime he wanted, as long as he didn't disturb the other customers. Harold had been coming every Tuesday since then, playing the songs that reminded him of better times. George sipped his coffee and listened to Harold's gentle playing, feeling more relaxed than he had in months. The old man played mostly classical pieces and old standards. Nothing George recognized specifically, but everything sounded like memories made into music. Then, without any announcement or fanfare, Harold began playing the opening notes of Careless Whisper. George nearly dropped his coffee mug. He looked up sharply, wondering if Harold somehow knew who he was. But the old man's eyes were closed, completely lost in the music, his arthritic fingers finding the melody despite their obvious pain. What struck George most wasn't just hearing his own song. It was how Harold played it. Slowly, gently, like a lullaby, like something precious that needed to be handled with care. The saxophone melody was translated into piano keys with such tenderness that it sounded like a completely different song, a more intimate song, a song about love and loss and the way memories can break your heart and heal it at the same time. George found himself listening to his own creation as if hearing it for the first time. Without the production, without his own voice, without the weight of its commercial success, Careless Whisper became something pure again, something that belonged to everyone who had ever felt the pain of loving someone they couldn't have. As Harold played, George noticed something else happening in the small cafe. The few other customers, an elderly woman reading a romance novel, a young mother feeding her toddler, a man in painter's clothes taking his lunch break, a teenage girl doing homework. All of them had stopped what they were doing to listen. But more than that, they were remembering. George could see it in their faces. The elderly woman's hand had moved to her chest, and tears were forming in her eyes. The young mother was looking at her child with such intensity, as if trying to memorize the moment. The painter had put down his sandwich and was staring out the window with a distant expression. Music, George realized, wasn't just entertainment. It was a time machine, a heart opener, a bridge between strangers who suddenly understood they weren't alone in their feelings. When Harold finished playing, the cafe was completely silent. Then the elderly woman began to clap, slowly and softly. The others joined in, not the wild applause of a concert, but the gentle appreciation of people who had just shared something sacred. "Beautiful," the woman said to Harold. "That song always reminds me of my late husband." Harold smiled sadly. "It reminds me of my Martha. We danced to it at our nephew's wedding just last year. She loved that song." "I played it at my father's funeral," the teenage girl said quietly. It was his favorite. George felt his throat tighten. His song, the song he'd written as a teenager about heartbreak and lost love, had become part of all these people's stories. It had soundtracked their weddings, their losses, their most important moments. And here they were, sharing those memories with a stranger in a tiny cafe. That's when George made a decision that surprised even him. He stood up, walked over to Harold, and quietly asked, "Mind if I join you?" Harold looked up, squinting through his thick glasses. "Of course, young man. Do you play?" George sat down on the piano bench beside Harold. "A little," he began, playing the opening chords of Careless Whisper again, but slower this time, softer. Harold's eyes lit up with delight, and he joined in, their four hands creating a duet on the old piano. The other customers gathered closer, drawn by the beautiful sound of two people making music together. But they still had no idea who George was. "You play that like you wrote it," Harold said with a chuckle. George smiled. "Maybe I did." As they played together, something magical happened in Rosie's cafe. The young mother began humming along. The elderly woman started singing quietly under her breath. The painter tapped his foot in rhythm. The teenage girl closed her homework and just listened with her eyes closed. When they finished the song, George looked around at these strangers who had become, for just a few minutes, a family connected by music. "Can I tell you all something?" George said, his voice barely above a whisper. They nodded, leaning in closer. "I wrote that song 20 years ago, when I was just a kid who thought he knew what heartbreak felt like. But sitting here today, listening to your stories, hearing Harold play it like a prayer, I'm realizing I never really understood my own song until this moment." The cafe went completely quiet. George removed his sunglasses and baseball cap. Recognition slowly dawned on their faces. "You're," the teenage girl whispered. "George Michael," he said simply. "And you've all just given me the greatest gift an artist can receive. You've shown me that music doesn't belong to the person who writes it. It belongs to everyone who needs it." What happened next was unlike anything George had ever experienced in his career. Instead of screaming or asking for autographs or taking pictures, these 6 strangers in a tiny cafe simply smiled at him with warmth and acceptance. "Well then," Rose said, emerging from behind the counter with tears in her eyes, "I suppose this calls for a proper pot of tea." For the next 2 hours, George sat in Rosie's cafe and heard stories. Harold told him about dancing with Martha to Careless Whisper at their 50th wedding anniversary. She couldn't walk very well by then, Harold whispered, his voice trembling. But when that song came on, she stood up and we danced in our living room. She died 2 days later. That was our last dance. The elderly woman, whose name was Margaret, shared how the song had helped her through her husband's long illness. I used to play it every night while he slept, she said, tears flowing freely. Somehow it made the hospital room feel less frightening. Even when he couldn't speak anymore, I'd see his fingers tapping to the rhythm. Music was the last language we shared. The young mother, Sarah, explained that she'd sung it as a lullaby to her son when he was born premature and fighting for his life. The doctors said singing might help his development. I didn't know any proper lullabies, so I sang Careless Whisper softly for hours. When he finally opened his eyes after 3 weeks, I swear he recognized the melody. Now he's 5, and he still asks me to sing the Whisper song before bed. The painter, whose name was David, spoke last. My daughter died in a car accident 2 years ago. She was 17. Careless Whisper was playing on her radio when it happened. I couldn't bear to hear it for months. But sitting here today, listening to Harold play it with such love, I realized the song isn't about my pain anymore. It's about her joy. She used to dance to it in her bedroom, thinking no one was watching. Each story broke George's heart and mended it at the same time. These people weren't fans in the traditional sense. They were fellow human beings who had let his music become part of their lives in ways he'd never imagined. They had taken his teenage heartbreak song and transformed it into something sacred, a soundtrack for love, loss, hope, and healing. I wrote that song when I was angry, George said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Angry at love, angry at loss, angry at growing up. But you've all shown me that anger can become something beautiful when people need it to be. When it was time to leave, George did something that surprised everyone. He asked Harold if he would teach him how to play Careless Whisper the way he had, slowly, tenderly, like a healing prayer instead of a pop song. For the next 3 months, every Tuesday at 3 p.m., George Michael could be found at Rosie's cafe, sitting at the old piano with Harold, learning not just how to play his own songs differently, but how to listen to music the way these strangers had taught him. The story of that afternoon only came out years later, when Harold passed away and his family found a journal where he'd written about his friendship with the famous musician who came to learn about music from an old man with broken fingers. George attended Harold's funeral and played Careless Whisper on that same old piano from Rosie's cafe, which the family had donated to the church. But he played it Harold's way, slowly, gently, like a lullaby for someone going to sleep. The other people from that Tuesday afternoon came to the funeral too. Margaret brought flowers. Sarah brought her son, now old enough to understand why his lullaby was so special. The teenage girl, now a young woman studying music therapy, played violin alongside George's piano. Rose closed her cafe permanently after Harold's death, saying it would never feel the same without the sound of music filling the air. But she kept the piano, and she still tells the story of the afternoon when a global superstar learned the true meaning of his own song from a lonely widower and a room full of strangers. George Michael said in later interviews that his time at Rosie's cafe changed everything about how he approached music. I thought I was hiding from the world that day, he said. Instead, I found it. The real world, where music isn't about charts or sales or fame. It's about connection, healing, and the way a melody can hold all the love and pain we can't put into words. The story reminds us that sometimes the most profound moments in our lives happen in the most ordinary places. That celebrities are just people looking for the same connection and meaning we all seek. And that music, at its best, doesn't divide us into artists and audiences. It reminds us that we're all just human beings trying to make sense of love, loss, and the precious time we have together. Sometimes the greatest performances aren't the ones seen by millions. They're the ones shared by a handful of strangers in a small cafe, where an old piano and a few broken hearts can create something more beautiful than any concert hall ever could.